Everybody's a narcissist now, right? Like everyone. Your ex is a narcissist. Your boss is a narcissist. Your mother is a narcissist. Your coworker, yeah, they're a narcissist. Your neighbor is a narcissist. Open social media and you'll find thousands of videos diagnosing complete strangers from 30-second clips. And honestly, the word has become so overused that it's starting to lose really a lot of meaning. But here's the problem. When we misunderstand narcissism, we miss something important. Because true narcissism isn't simply arrogance, right? It isn't having a big personality, and it isn't just being selfish. In many ways, narcissism is one of the most tragic psychological conditions we encounter. Because beneath the superiority, beneath the grandiosity, beneath the need for attention, there's often something much more fragile. Today we're talking about what narcissism actually is. The psychology, the neurobiology, and the damage it causes, the pain that it often creates, and why the people who appear strongest on the outside may secretly be fighting a battle they never let anyone see. This is The Forge. What's up, guys? Welcome back to The Forge. Sorry for just the audio podcast. So a lot of things are happening at The Forge right now. The studio is currently kind of in some disarray. It's getting an overhaul. It's getting a renovation. It's really coming together to represent something more of what we are, right? So to spare you guys the awful view of literally just chaos in my office right now, we're gonna just roll good old fashioned audio on this one. Besides, I'm not really much to look at. Let's be honest. No, I'm just kidding with myself. Well, I'm not kidding. I don't think I'm something to look at, but well, let's just get into it, right? On that note, narcissism. Right? Today we're stepping into one of the most misunderstood subjects in modern psychology, right? And before we begin, let's establish something important. This episode is educational. I'm not here to diagnose public figures. I'm not here to tell you your ex was a narcissist. And I'm certainly not here to encourage you to start practicing some armchair psychology. I'm not doing that. Get on TikTok. You'll certainly see enough people convince you of ways that you can successfully identify narcissists in a matter of 15 to 30 seconds. And all of that is bullshit. It's bullshit. What I am here to do is help you understand a condition that has become part of really everyday language, and it still remains so poorly understood, because understanding narcissism helps us understand something even bigger. And I'm talking about human vulnerability. That's what we're really talking about. So what narcissism actually is. Well, let's start by clearing up the biggest misconception. Most people think narcissism means arrogance, and it means ego, and it means selfishness, confidence, being full of yourself. But really, clinically, narcissism is often much more complicated, right? It's much more complicated than that. And at its core, narcissism involves a deeply unstable sense of self-worth. That's what we're talking about. Now, that may surprise some of you because narcissistic individuals often appear incredibly confident, right? Like they're so incredibly confident. But appearance and reality are not always the same things. And, healthy confidence says, I don't know, it says, I know who I am. Narcissism often says, please keep proving to me who I am, right? And think about that. One comes from internal stability, and the other depends on external reinforcement. It really does. And that's a huge distinction. A healthy person, can receive praise and they can appreciate it. But a narcissistic person often needs praise to maintain sort of this emotional equilibrium, right? So without it, things really begin to fracture in their psyche. Just some factual bits about narcissism that took way longer than 15 seconds. Freaking TikTok psychologists, unbelievable. But when we're talking about narcissistic traits versus narcissistic personality disorder, we're kind of talking about two different things, right? So let's make another distinction. Every human being on the face of the earth has narcissistic traits. I said it. Every single one of us. Yeah, I said it. No, I'm not wrong. I said it. We all enjoy recognition. We all like appreciation, and we all want to feel important. That's normal. The issue isn't having narcissistic traits. The issue is when those traits become rigid, right? Those traits become pervasive and start to damage people. So narcissistic personality disorder typically includes patterns such as grandiosity, right? I am some kind of extra special being above all other people, right? A belief in one's specialness, a need for this admiration, right? Entitlement, difficulty empathizing with others, right? So empathy, again, we may have talked about this before, but empathy is the capacity to have an understanding of what someone is experiencing, even if you haven't understood, even if you don't really understand it yourself, right? So like, for example, you may be someone who has lost a parent, right? You may be someone who has, I don't know, been put in jail before, right? I don't have to be put in jail to understand and have a healthy idea that that must have been a difficult time for you, right? I don't need that first person experience to say, wow, that must have been very difficult time for you, right? So that difficulty empathizing with others. Narcissistic personality disorder, they also have this exploitation of relationships, extreme sensitivity to criticism. So notice something here, right? The problem isn't confidence, right? The problem is dependency. And, the person becomes dependent on admiration to regulate their self-worth. That is what narcissism is. And that's where relationships with narcissistic individuals begin to suffer. Big time suffer. You know me, we're going to have to talk about the neurobiology of this because I love the brain and I love its magic. I love the brain magic. So what does neurobiology of a narcissism look like, right? Let's talk about the brain for a second. So because narcissism isn't simply a character flaw, it's connected really to how people process identity, threat, reward, and emotion. That's really, I would say, if somebody knows something else besides me, please put it in the comments. But to me, that's really the big four, right? Narcissism is how people process identity, threat, reward, and emotion. And one area of interest that I have really involves that self-esteem regulation, being able to regulate our self-esteem. And some research really kind of is starting to suggest that individuals with strong narcissistic traits often have self-esteem that appears high externally, but fluctuates dramatically internally. Now, I know you're probably thinking like, we really needed research to tell us that. Yes, the hell we did, right? Because otherwise it's just an assumption. So I'm glad that research is finally starting to put forth some real scientific evidence that, again, self-esteem appears super high on the outside, but it really fluctuates a lot inside, right? So kind of imagine, I guess, for a second, like imagine a skyscraper built on unstable ground. So from a distance, that building looks so impressive, right? But underneath, the foundation is constantly shifting. So there is this degree of like, wow, that's really awesome looking, but that is wildly unstable and unsafe and unpredictable, right? So from a distance, again, it looks impressive. And that's often what narcissistic functioning looks like. So let's talk about some criticism here. Most people dislike criticism. They do. You can be one of those people that's like, oh, I really love criticism. No, you don't. No, you don't. Just stop. You do not. But for someone with strong narcissistic traits, criticism is way more than just not appreciating it, not enjoying it. It feels catastrophic. It feels catastrophic to a narcissist to be criticized. Why? Well, because criticism isn't really experienced as information to a narcissist. It's experienced as a threat, right? The brain reacts as if identity itself is under attack. So that can trigger, right, the defensiveness, the rage, the blame, the humiliation, the retaliation. And psychologists sometimes refer to this as a narcissistic injury. Gotta love that, right? We can't just say that our feelings are hurt anymore. We have to say it's a narcissistic injury. It is. I mean, it is a narcissistic injury, but basically what we're saying is these motherfuckers are really going to hurt our feelings. And they're really going to hurt our feelings way more than just the average individual. And when a narcissistic injury occurs, people may witness what is called narcissistic rage. So when that narcissist receives injury, that can lead to some rage. And it's not because the criticism they received was any worse than the criticism that you and I received. It's because the criticism pierced something incredibly fragile underneath, right? You ever hear that phrase like, I really struck a nerve? That's kind of what we're talking about here. Striking a nerve that is so sensitive that just leads someone into just a blind fit of rage. That's pretty heavy, right? So if this is kind of what happens in our brain, if one is a narcissist, where do they come from, right? Is this something that we're born with? Is this something that narcissists, are they created by society, by environment? Or are we looking at like this big biological, sociological, psychological, pathway? Well, let's talk about where this comes from. And to be honest, here's the answer that I don't think we hear too often. There's no single pathway that creates a narcissist, right? There's no single pathway. Human beings are complicated. Duh. We are so complicated. Like, we're so complicated that it's almost impossible to really get a generalization on someone's psychological makeup, right? I mean, we do it all the time, but it's really difficult, right? It really is difficult. You know, some narcissistic traits develop in environments where children are excessively praised. They're just excessively praised all the time. They're not really supported. They're not encouraged. They're really just praised in like unrealistic ways, right? So messages like, you're better than everyone else. You know that. You're the most beautiful person in the world. You know, you're special beyond criticism. The rules don't apply to you because you're perfect, right? Those messages can severely distort self-development. They really can. And I'm not saying that every parent out there that treats their child in some form or fashion of this way is going to turn their kid into a narcissist. That's really not what I'm saying. But interestingly enough about this, many narcissistic individuals come from the opposite environment, right? So while all of this excessive praise can certainly develop the narcissistic traits, they don't quite cause narcissistic personality disorder. They don't quite cause that disorder. The opposite really does, right? An individual who has been severely neglected, an individual who has experienced emotional abandonment, chronic invalidation, being unseen, being invisible, feeling invisible, like no one cares about you. Growing up, maybe feeling like, I don't know, I'm just fundamentally unimportant. And eventually the psyche develops a solution, right? If I grow up feeling neglected, chronically invalidated, being unseen, being invisible, I'm probably going to develop a very robust solution so that I don't feel that pain all the time, right? I'm probably going to form a protective shell, a psychological suit of armor, right? A grandiose identity that protects a deeply wounded self. And that's why many experts, when we're talking about a view of narcissism, experts will view narcissism not as excessive self-love, right? But as a defense, really against shame. That's what we're talking about. On the outside, right? We will see someone who is so elated with themselves, but it's a defense against the shame internal dialogue, the shameful internal dialogue and emotions that they feel about themselves. So, you know, what is this grandiose and vulnerable narcissism, right? Most people only recognize one type of narcissism, right? The one type of narcissist, the loud type, the obvious type. The grandiose narcissist, right? This person may appear dominant, charismatic, confident, attention seeking. They might seem very important. They might seem very powerful. You know, they might walk into a room and expect attention. But here's another form, right? I think we all can agree that we have seen the grandiose narcissist, right? The it person who knows they're the it thing, right? We know those people. But yeah, the other form, the vulnerable narcissism, this one I think is often overlooked. I don't know about any of you therapists out there that's listening, but I personally have not seen too many vulnerable narcissists. These individuals may appear sensitive, right? They may appear insecure. They may appear victimized. They may appear chronically misunderstood, easily offended, highly reactive. They still maintain an exaggerated focus on themselves. It just looks a lot different, right? It just looks a lot different. And instead of superiority, you may see really just like chronic resentment, right? Like just in a state of just resenting everything and everyone. And instead of arrogance, you may see like just this perpetual grievance, right? Like it's always something else. It's always somebody. Someone is always to blame. It's never my fault. And that's why narcissism really can be difficult to recognize, because it wears so many masks. You know, throughout history, right, we've seen leaders who displayed traits often associated with narcissism. And again, we're not diagnosing anyone here. We're discussing observable characteristics. So history gives us examples really of leaders who cultivated personality cults, right? Grand visions of like destiny. And they're extremely sensitive to criticism, right? And leaders who like have a belief that they alone possess some kind of special insight, right? So figures, I think some figures we might, we'll go way back in history. So that way, we don't tick anybody off in the present right now. But I think figures such as like Napoleon Bonaparte, Joseph Stalin, Hitler, are often discussed by historians in this context, right? And what makes these examples important isn't simply personality, it's scale. Because when narcissistic traits combine with power, God, the consequences can become enormous, right? The need for admiration becomes like national policy, right? Like it becomes national policy. The inability to tolerate criticism leads to, oppression. It leads to genocide. It leads to, you name it. The sky is the limit, right? The fragile ego of the narcissist in power becomes very dangerous. It becomes very dangerous. So, I'm a lover and a hater of social media. I really am. I understand it's here. I don't want to sound old and be like, oh my gosh, like it's ruining all of our kids. I don't want to say that. But a question that I get quite often is, does social media, is it making us more narcissistic as a society? So I want to ask a very provocative question, right? What kind of personalities does modern culture reward? Think about that for a second, right? Think about that for a second. What kind of personalities are rewarded in modern culture? Every single day, we are encouraged to almost build a personal brand. We're encouraged to track likes. We're encouraged to track followers. We're encouraged to track engagement, to curate an image, right? To present ourselves constantly. Now, does social media create narcissism? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Because I also have to acknowledge that, like, if you are someone that has a very positive intention on building a personal brand, right? You do have to essentially track likes, track followers. It's part of a business model of growth, right? So that inherently does not make someone narcissistic, but it certainly rewards behaviors that resemble narcissistic traits. It does. Attention becomes currency, and how visible we are, it becomes valuable. And eventually some people begin confusing attention with worth, right? It's confusing attention with worth. That's kind of what I think where the line starts to cross. And man, confusing attention for something that you are curating and creating with your own personal self-worth, right? That's dangerous, man. That is dangerous territory, because attention is temporary, right? I don't care if you're a TikTok famous person. I don't care if you're a big movie star, celebrity. You're going to become unfamous someday, and no one is going to care about you. That is the reality, right? I don't care if you're the next new it person on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, if anybody even uses that garbage anymore. I don't really know. But I do know that your attention is temporary. You will one day see that no one actually cares about you in that way, in that manner. You know, identity is much deeper than that. It's much deeper than that. So as to, does social media create narcissism? No. But it sure kind of makes the water a little bit warmer to pick up some of those narcissistic traits. That's where I think the problem is, right? If we as a society have individuals who are a little bit mentally unstable and they have the power at their disposal with these devices to build a brand, track likes, track followers, curate an image, and present themselves on a fairly consistent basis. I don't know. And I think, as we've talked about narcissism so far, the thing that I feel like not enough clinically minded individuals say, and I say clinically minded, meaning myself, other clinicians, other therapists, things that really aren't talked about enough, right? Again, you can get on TikTok and you can see 5 ways to leave a narcissistic relationship, 5 ways to identify narcissism. It's all spoken about as if it's a very terrible thing. And it is, right? It's a terrible, terrible thing. And it's terrible for the innocent bystanders, for certain. But really, here's the tragedy that, it's truly a tragedy. Many narcissistic individuals, they suffer enormously. And it's not always in obvious ways, but internally, right? Because relationships to them become very transactional. Connection becomes conditional. Love really becomes like performance. And genuine intimacy becomes difficult. Why? Right? Because intimacy requires vulnerability. And vulnerability threatens that protective shell. So a narcissist essentially remains trapped in their shell. They are constantly seeking validation. They are constantly seeking admiration. They're constantly seeking this proof of self-worth, yet never feeling secure about it, no matter what. And that's exhausting. I mean, I would imagine it's exhausting. I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know. I think it's safe to say that I'm not a narcissist. But I would imagine it's exhausting to keep that up. And it's exhausting for everyone involved. But that includes the narcissist themselves, right? So, this is not me saying, hey, if you know someone or if you yourself were harmed by a narcissist, like, give them some sympathy and forgive and forget. I'm not saying that, because narcissistic people can be incredibly abusive and they are incredibly dangerous at times. Some can be incredibly dangerous, right? But, for those of us who have ever encountered a narcissist and say, my God, like, karma's going to catch up to them. Listen, karma has already caught up to them. they are essentially locked in to this shell that they can't escape, that, to be honest, they don't even realize it, right? They don't even realize it. And what a terrible life to live. What a terrible life to live. I think, I want you to think about something as we kind of wrap up here. I want you to think about, right, in your life, where do you depend on external validation? Maybe it's your partner. Maybe it's the guys at the firehouse. Maybe it's your station buddies. I don't know. But where in your life do you depend on external validation? Where do you need someone else's approval to feel valuable? Because I'm going to be honest, we all do, right? In some places. And think about, that confusion between attention with worth, right? I think that's another thing that we've all, as humans, as a part of this human condition and human experience, I think we've all felt a little bit of that at times, right? So here's where I think we should probably sum this up, right? Narcissism is not confidence. Confidence is stable. Narcissism, that's fragile. And confidence doesn't require an audience, right? Narcissism often requires an audience, and the bigger, the better. Confidence survives criticism. Narcissism struggles a ton to tolerate criticism, right? And I think perhaps the greatest lesson narcissism teaches us is this: the loudest person in the room is most often not the strongest. And the most confident looking person is not always the most secure. Sometimes the greatest displays of superiority are actually desperate attempts to protect a wounded self, right? A wounded part of yourself. And understanding that doesn't excuse harmful behavior. I'm going to say that again. Understanding a narcissist doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it does help us understand the human being behind it. Thanks so much, guys. This is The Forge. In chaos will thrive!